Hello, and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today we bring you Bookshelf, an episode dedicated to the books we're reading outside of book club, the ones we get to pick and choose for ourselves. We're joined by one of our favourite readers and friend of the pod, journalist Phil Chaffee. And so listen in as we discuss his light holiday reading, The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, and My Fourth Time We Drowned by Sally Hayden. Meanwhile, a book I read recently has instantly become one of my all-time favourites, and that is O Caledonia by Elspeth Barker. I can't wait to tell you why I think you will love it too. I've also been very happily immersed in This Savage Song by fantasy writer V.E. Schwab.
Not to be outdone, I'm reporting back on historical thriller The 16 Trees of the Somme by Lars Mytting, and Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Sympathiser by Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Keep listening to hear what we thought of them.
All that coming up here on the Book Club Review. Kate, on our last bookshelf show, we were super excited because it had been a very long time since we talked about the books that we read outside of book club. I'm almost even more excited because we're joined by Phil Chaffee.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's so nice to have you back. I always want to know what you're reading. And suddenly we thought, we could just invite you to one of our bookshelves and then we'd know what you were reading. So yeah, what have you been reading recently?
A bunch. I was just on holiday in Italy, and I always make a point of trying to read Italian things, and I won't bore you with all of them, but one I finally got to is Hardly a Discovery. Millions of people read this.
Is it Elena Ferrante?
It was not Elena Ferrante. I read that before my holiday and finally finished the Neapolitan cycle, but started in and then finished after the holiday with The Name of the Rose, the Umberto Eco, which I had started and stopped a lot previously. It's an amazing book, but it's pretty dense, and it starts pretty dense. Have either of you read it?
I have read it, but when I was really young, I feel like it probably falls into the category of books that I read when I was too young to really appreciate it, probably like Middlemarch, that kind of thing. So I bet if I came back to it again, I'd have a really different experience.
Almost certainly.
I remember it being quite hard going.
Yeah, and it, even as an adult, parts are hard going, but it was made into a movie with Sean Connery in the 80s, and the BBC did a production of it a couple of years ago because there is a superficial murder plot. It's set in the early 14th century at this Italian monastery on top of a mountain. A monk and his assistant arrive. The assistant is a narrator of the novel, but from years in the future, he's looking back on the events. And they arrive for separate reasons from the rest of the plot, but then there has been a potential murder, potential suicide at the monastery. And so there's a superficial plot that propels you through. Monks keep getting knocked off, which is really fun. But it's also, the plot is basically pretty dumb, and it doesn't quite make sense once you get to the end. This was Umberto Eco's first novel, and he was already a philosopher and a historian and a semiotician. And this plot device is mainly there as scaffolding for him to have fun with all of these other things. The philosophical debates of the early 14th century, but also these amazing fun dives into what is knowledge and how can we know things, and plenty of other philosophical things, some of which probably went over my head. But ultimately, it was just a really, really fun read. And if you have tried it before, as I had multiple times, do try to force yourself through, I would say, because it turns into a really, really good romp.
Some books just need a good bit of concentrated time, don't they? You can't just keep picking them up and putting them down on the tube or whatever. And then when you get that time, suddenly they can open up like flowers. So it sounds like this might be in that category.
Absolutely. And each time I had gotten 20 pages in, 30 pages in. It's one of those things which starts with 10-page introduction of someone finding this fictional lost manuscript. So it takes a whole while for really to get to the actual plot and to what he's actually doing. But then once you're there, I don't know, it was unputdownable for me.
That is intriguing. I think I started it as a teenager and put it down because I found it was far more dry than I had expecting. But maybe now that I am a grown-up like you, Phil, I should try it again. I also find it hard to believe that the philosophy was over your head. Kate, maybe that's a companion novel after your devotion to Matrix by Lauren Groff.
Well, I was
Pivot
wondering...
and take your love of nuns and transfer it to love of monks.
Yeah, I was wondering whether, given my new interest in medieval nuns, whether I would now have more interest in medieval monks.
Yeah, I actually thought of it mainly because I think there's one female character in this who I don't think we hear anything of what she says. It's entirely a homosocial environment, just like Matrix. And I think Lauren Groff had realized there was this literature of stuff set in monasteries where there are no women. And I'm sure she was thinking about that when she did her counterpoint.
One for the monk-nun canon, which, after Matrix, I think a lot of people are seeking out.
Exactly.
How about you, Laura? What have you been reading?
Keeping with the theme of holiday reading, this is a bit of a loose segue, because I read The 16 Trees of the Somme by Lars Mytting. I did not read it on holiday. However, I think it's such a great holiday read. It's a literary historical thriller. And it was sent to me by Andrew at Abrams Press in New York, who listens to the pod and said, I think you guys might like this book. And I think, Kate, you actually said, no, Andrew, we're too busy reading other things. And I was like, well, hang on a minute, because the blurb really captured my attention.
And I should interject, he sent a PDF with that email. And I idly opened the PDF, having assured him that we were far too busy to squeeze it in. And then I read the first few pages and I was sort of like, oh, I was kind of hooked. So then I was really pleased that you picked up on it.
Let me read you guys the blurb just really quickly, because there's a lot I could say about this, but let's start with what the publisher said. An engrossing literary novel about a family mystery, revenge, and forgiveness. The 16 Trees of the Somme is an intricately plotted and enthralling novel by the award-winning author of Norwegian Wood and The Bell in the Lake. An international bestseller and long-listed for the Dublin Literary Prize, which devoted listeners will know is one of our favourite prizes. The 16 Trees of the Somme tells the story of Edvard and starts at his family's tree farm in Norway, where he was raised by his grandfather. The death of Edvard's parents when he was 3 has always been a mystery, but he knows that the fate of his grandfather's brother Einar is somehow connected. One day a coffin is delivered to the farm for his grandfather, long before the grandfather's death, a meticulous, beautiful, and unique piece of craftsmanship with the hallmarks of a certain master craftsman, raising the thought that Einar isn't dead after all. Edvard is now driven to unravel the mystery of his parents' death, following a trail of clues from Norway to the Shetland Islands to the battlefields of France and 16 ancient walnut trees coloured by poison gas in World War I. Edvard ultimately discovers a very unusual inheritance. In the first instance, it reminded me a little bit of Tana French, who is a very, very successful crime novelist. I've only read one of her books, whose name eludes me at this moment.
The Witch Elm?
Yeah.
The Witch Elm, that's the one. And I would recommend that. The parallels, I think, are a sense of tone, a sense of unease and mystery, and something dark hidden below the surface of everyday life. And then in both cases, we have this male protagonist who may or may not be unreliable. Edvard has grown up on this tree farm in northern Norway. He actually is a bit of an outcast because his grandfather, who has raised him after his parents' death, was a collaborator, the Germans. This is a slice of Norwegian history I was totally unaware of. But there were people who didn't see the Nazis necessarily as an invading force, but as allies who were driven to create a different type of Europe. And so his grandfather left and fought with the German army. And then after World War II was a pariah within his community. And that actually then came down to this young man growing up. We get to go to the Shetland Islands because that is where his great uncle may have been living. I won't give too much away. There's a thread of romance when he crosses paths with this young posh woman who's living in this crumbling mansion on the Shetland Islands, and she has an agenda of her own. We get to then travel down to France with flashbacks to family history and World War I, all circling in on the mystery of what happened to his parents. We know how they die, but how did it happen? And why did Edvard survive? And there's another missing piece of information there too that he needs to dig into. So good. Really well written, but not so literary. That plot isn't allowed to let rip and just drag you in. I super recommend it for holiday reading. And hey, in fact, maybe if you don't have a lot of time to read, I still think this would be the book to hook you so that at the end of a long day at work, you want to pick it up and dig in. What do you think? Have I convinced you guys?
Sounds amazing. Yeah, I'm going to read it right after this. That sounds so good.
When you mentioned about the trees being coloured by the poison gas, that made me think of Cal Flynn's book, Islands of Abandonment, which I read recently, which I want to talk about properly on another bookshelf. But that book is exploring the places where man has had a usually devastating effect on the natural landscape. So the big example is, say, Chernobyl and the area around there, and what's happened to it, what's happened to nature and how nature has crept back. But one of the most haunting chapters in that book is that she goes to a place in Verdun in France. It's a spot in the woods where after the armistice, the Allies had to detonate all of their leftover munitions. And so it was all collected up and it was all detonated in this one grove, in this woodland, in this sort of huge explosion and all these chemicals. And to this day, that grove is a completely toxic environment. You can't go there. It's absolutely sealed off. But there's something about it. She does manage to go, and she sort of isn't able to go right up to it, but she's able to get to the fence and look in. And there was just something so, I don't know, so haunting and evocative about that idea of this physical remnant of this conflict that had marred the landscape. And yet the way that nature, despite everything, is creeping back and actually looked at in some ways is more robust than it had been prior to the catastrophic event. It's such a strange book because in some senses it's very dark because it is about the ravages of humanity upon the natural world. But then the hopeful element is that time and time again she's exploring the way that nature actually does regenerate. And so the hope is really, it's a very long view hope. Because basically it's the reassurance that once none of us are around anymore, the planet will be fine. and that is something. It's sort of depressing, but also...
We like being around, though.
I know. But that was not the book I had planned to talk about. I wanted to talk about a book called Oh, Caledonia by Elspeth Barker, which I feel is having a bit of a moment right now, and rightfully so. The author actually died a couple of weeks ago, and I think as a result, a lot of people have been talking about her, and this book has been popping up in discussions and in reviews and obituaries and things like that. But prior to that, I think over the course of the last few months, it has been having a bit of a resurgence. I think Vintage just republished it with an introduction by Maggie O'Farrell. And then someone, I don't know who, but someone had recommended it to me, and I'd done what I often do, which is I'd ordered it from the London Library. Because London Library books are quite a slow burn, often people have them out on loan. In the London Library, you can keep books out for months. One book I finally got hold of had been out for a year. So it's just So anyway, the point is I forget all about these requisitions. And then suddenly this brilliant package arrives in the post and I open it because the membership I have is where they send the books to you. And it was Oh, Caledonia. Oh, great. So I idly opened it, just meaning to have a little look. And from the very first page, I was, oh, this is going to be so good. It's the coming-of-age story. It is, I think, quite a good way to describe it as a sort of inverted I Capture the Castle. Jodie Smith's lovely, warm, romantic story about this girl growing up with sort of nutty family and living in this crumbling castle. This is like the inverse of that. It's a girl growing up in a horrible castle with a horrible family where she's pretty miserable. She's a child. She's got a child's heart and she reaches out to the world around her and the adults around her and people just do horrible things to her all the time. And there's this one line I absolutely loved, which is at one point when she's very young and her mother has a new baby. And so it's classic sibling rivalry. She doesn't like the new baby and she takes the pram out to the garden and basically tries to bury it in leaves. And then she comes back and tells the parents, oh, you don't have to worry. The other baby's gone. It's okay. I've got rid of the other baby. And they're, furious and upset with her. And there's just this one line at a young age, realizing she doesn't have her mother's love. A splinter, a tiny shard of ice crystal had entered her heart and lodged there. And From that moment on, it's her against the world. And your sympathies are with her all the way. But she isn't particularly nice, so you can't really like her that much. Anyway, I'm missing the big event, which happens basically on the first page of the novel, where you find out that at the age of 16, she dies. She's murdered in the castle. And there's this, I told you, it's incredibly dark. And then the rest of the book, and it's not a long book, is tracing her childhood growing up, and you always know then that this event is coming. So if you're like me, you're trying all the time to not get attached to her. There's no point, is there? kind of thing. Knowing what's coming, and yet you just can't not. She's such an extraordinary character. She's so bright, she's so interesting, and the way that she sees this world that she's in is so sharp and perfect. And I was trying to think as I was reading it, what is it about this? Why do I like this so much? And I found myself thinking it's because I'm constantly surprised by it. And I think that is quite a rare thing. You know, when you read a lot, obviously every book is different, but nonetheless, it's really rare, I think, from sentence to sentence, to be surprised and to be delighted because you just don't know where it's going to take you next. And it was such an unexpected read and so great. And it's had a lot of love. And I love that Maggie O'Farrell, when she wrote about it, she said that she once decided to be friends with someone solely on the basis that this person had named O Caledonia their favourite book. And I finished it and I was like, yeah, that is a pretty good test. If someone told me that they loved this book, I'd be like, oh, okay, I must befriend you. Interestingly, one of our lovely followers on Instagram messaged me, Pauline Mason, who often sends very interesting, thoughtful comments. She had read it with her book club and they hadn't got on with it at all. So, you know, it's not universal. Like maybe it just somehow struck with my mood and the moment in my life that I'm at where I read it. As a parent myself, I am endlessly fascinated by stories narrated by children who have terrible parents. I never don't find that interesting. I think I'm just trying to figure out like what not to do. And this is that. So, you know, perhaps it's not for everyone in the way that I just thought, who would not love this book? So read it, try it, and see what you think. O Caledonia by Elspeth Barker.
Kate, I don't think Phil or I ever put on your radar a book club book from the end of last year called A High Wind in Jamaica by Richard Hughes. Did we ever touch on that?
Given that I like this, do you think I would like that?
Great follow-up.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's that about?
Talk about disturbing novels from the children's perspective. You think it's going to be a high adventure in the Robinson Crusoe style, don't you?
Yeah, and I think it is taught in British schools, or at least this was some anecdotal things we were getting in the discussion, as this fun children's book about these kids who are taken by pirates as they come back from Jamaica to the UK. But it is very dark, but very fun as well, even though there's rape and all this other awful stuff happening.
It's from the children's perspective, though, so they don't fully understand what's happening. And so you can also see that if you were 13 or 14 and read it, you probably wouldn't pick up on what is clearly happening to one of the older girls. It is surprising. And talk about a good book club book. I don't think anyone loved it.
I pretty much loved it. Yeah,
Did you?
And then we did have someone who didn't join who said she despised it. And she just was absolutely nauseated by it. So
how interesting.
Very curious for your reaction.
It's disturbing.
Who is that by?
A High Wind in Jamaica by Richard Hughes. And I will read O Caledonia if you read that one, Kate. And we can swap perspectives.
Deal, because I know that one of us is going to read something brilliant.
Who's next?
Phil, back to you.
I have a truly dark book, which I just finished, a book that came out this year called My Fourth Time We Drowned, Seeking Refuge on the World's Deadliest Migration Route.
Oh, I've read about this.
By Sally Hayden.
This sounds like a very timely book.
It's a very timely book. It is incredibly well written. It made me cry. The bigger emotion, though, was just fury at the system that has created this. Let me just read the blurb. Sally Hayden is this Irish journalist, and in August 2018, she received a Facebook message. Hi, Sister Sally, we need your help, it read. We are under bad condition in Libya prison. If you have time, I will tell you all the story. More messages followed from more refugees. They told stories of enslavement and trafficking, torture and murder, tuberculosis and sexual abuse. And they revealed something else, that they were all incarcerated as a direct result of European policy. It's obviously a very serious topic. You learn a whole lot about, particularly after 2015, EU policies to basically fund and cooperate with the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept all of the refugees trying to get across the Mediterranean, take them back to these hellish camps in Libya, where then the UNHCR, the big UN refugee agency, would come and visit and give its stamp, its imprimatur. But these are just awful and full of slavery and torture and rape and death. Beyond that, she also gives a history of a lot of the countries these places are coming from. So I did not know much about how awful the situation is in Eritrea. Then in the middle of this, in her reporting, war in Libya breaks out again, the civil war. All of this sounds incredibly dark, and it is, but she does manage to have some positive stories at the end. I put it down and thought, everyone, particularly in Europe, but the issues in North America are not that dissimilar, just slightly you have to change some of the details, or in Australia for that matter. But I just felt like everyone has to read this book. It is astonishing. Sally Hayden is just amazing, and you really get a sense of who some of these refugees and migrants are. I was absolutely floored by it.
And is there any suggestion of any possibility of a solution, a better way?
No, I mean,
because feel like that's why I find these books hard. It's not that I don't want to read the stories, it's that I find it so frustrating reading about things where there seems to be no way of changing any of it. It just seems to be this is the way it is.
Yeah, and I mean, the point that is made in the book is, I think by multiple people, that the countries enacting this system and really pushing things in the EU and at the UNHCR are democratic countries, and they are responding to their populations because their politicians know that the second there's enough migrants or refugees there, they might be voted out of office. And we've seen this populism everywhere, from Marine Le Pen to Donald Trump. And I think it's above Sally Hayden's pay grade to expect her to give us a solution. But I also feel like just because there's not a solution doesn't mean we shouldn't be reading it. It's an astonishing book. It was also a page turner. I mean, it's very engrossing and compelling. But yeah, not particularly light holiday reading.
Yeah, no, I did think it looked really interesting. And as you say, an important book. Reminds me when I interviewed Jacques Testard, who's the publisher at Fitzcarraldo, he gave me a few books to take away. And one of them was a book called The Naked Don't Fear the Water by Mathieu Aikins. And he is Canadian, but because of his own heritage, he looks like an Afghan. He's got the same physiognomy. And he has a friend in Kabul where he had worked as a reporter, and this friend messages him and says, I'm going to try and make it to Europe. And he decides to travel with him and experience that journey alongside him. And I think this book then is about that journey and what that's like. And I believe there are a couple of moments where they're in such difficulties and he is able to pull out his passport, and that sort of saves the situation. But most of the time, as I understand it, he's absolutely at his friend's side experiencing the same thing. And when Jacques gave it to me, I said, is it going to make me cry? And he said, yes. But he said it's a book, as you just said, it's a book that everyone should read.
That does remind me, one big point of this book is so many of these refugees, by the time they reach Libya, have gone through so much, both in their home countries and the oppression they face there, in the routes getting to the Mediterranean. And then many of them get trapped in these camps. Maybe they finally escape the camp and try to cross, and then suddenly they're back in these camps.
Yeah.
And they've spent years of their life. It's absolutely heartbreaking.
And you know what? Maybe if we can't do anything, the very least we could do is read their stories and understand about what's happening. Laura.
The next book I was going to talk to you about is The Sympathiser by Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is an American Vietnamese academic. And this is not a book that has flown beneath the radar, although it seems to be having a bit of a resurgence. It won the Pulitzer in 2016, but for some reason, book club members were saying they keep seeing it everywhere, so people are coming back to it. It's described as a blistering exploration of identity politics in America, wrought in electric prose. The narrator, a Vietnamese army captain, is a man of divided loyalties, a half-French, half-Vietnamese communist sleeper agent in America after the end of the Vietnam War. A powerful story of love and friendship and a gripping espionage novel, The Sympathiser examines the legacy of the Vietnam War in literature, film, and the wars we fight today. And Phil, before we started recording, you were saying you have read this, right?
Yes, I read it maybe a year ago.
And it is really good. Yeah. It's a really good book. It is also a very dense book. I think it's the longest 380-page book I've ever read. I think if we had introduced paragraph breaks and a different typesetting, it would easily be 700 pages. And Nguyen is an academic, and so he is really setting out to critique American society, to critique American depictions of the Vietnam War and depictions of Vietnamese people. And it's angry, and we have this strong satirical narrative voice. The narrator himself, I would say, isn't necessarily angry, or if he is, it's in kind of a suppressed way, because the book is called The Sympathiser. And he says at the very beginning that he is able to sympathize and understand American culture and American people. He himself is the son of a young Vietnamese woman. She was only 14 when she had him, and a white French priest who quite clearly, raped his young maid. What could I say? I feel slightly overwhelmed by talking about it because it's such an intelligent book. And despite what the description says about it being blistering and an espionage tale and lots of action, actually there are moments of that, but there's also a lot of polemic layered in. And I think sometimes satire is also difficult to engage with. Characters are a little bit stereotyped. There's one figure called the crapulent major who our narrator has to kill because he's suspected of being a communist mole. And so the narrator, to preserve his own undercover status, has to off him in a garage in suburban California. It's a great book. It's a challenging book. And I haven't actually finished it. And most of my book club hadn't. And it sounds like it just gets darker and darker and darker, because we know that the narrator is actually writing his confession that he must be back in Vietnam a decade on, perhaps, from the main events of this book, maybe less. And he's being interrogated, I think, for his sympathies to the Americans, and in some form would have to prove his loyalty to communism afresh. And it sounds like that gets really, really dark. So I don't know that I'm going to read it. What did you think of this one, Phil?
Wait, you don't know if you're going to finish it?
I don't know. Do I have to?
I just can't imagine getting as far as you obviously have and not. It's it's so compulsive, that book. I thought it was great, and actually,
did you find it compulsive?
Yeah,
interesting. I don't think I did.
Interesting. His anger, and he's such an interesting character. That is really what kept me going, and I just wanted to know how it all ended, and now that I say this, I can't actually remember how it all ended.
I believe there's torture involved, which is why I was a bit put off.
But there are some big, amazing scenes that I remember this, including all of these Vietnamese who have worked with the Americans as Saigon is falling, what it was like at the airport as the last planes are trying to get out. I mean, that is sort of burned in my head. It was such an amazing
that is
scene.
High cinematic prose, isn't it? Yeah, when they talk about it being gripping, that moment too, I could not put it down. Yeah. You were just there. You could see it as if it was on a big screen at the cinema with all the noise and chaos surrounding you.
I was just so driven, I think, beyond those cinematic scenes, by also this character who is a communist, but also is very attracted to the West and is in this in-between space and attracted to a lot of the accoutrements of capitalism. That particular spice blend just seemed really, really compulsive to me. And it's not a spoiler to say that there is a sequel to this, which I have not read yet, with the same character in Paris, I think.
It's called The Committed. I just Googled it. The Committed follows the unnamed Sympathiser as he arrives in Paris in the early 1980s.
Yeah. I will read that at some point because I am pretty sold on the author.
Maybe you shame me into finishing it.
For the newsletter, I occasionally do this thing about a dictionary of words for bookish states or experiences where I feel like there's no word. The Germans would probably have a word, but we don't have a word. I'm just thinking there's another one there, isn't there, about the experience of reading a book, knowing that there's another book?
Yeah.
Because it does slightly affect your reading of the book you're reading if you know that there's a follow-on or something else to come. Also, if the real world seems too dark and depressing and frankly terrifying, you can always escape into fantasy. Would you like to know what I've been reading recently?
Absolutely.
With some things on my mind that I'm trying to procrastinate and not think about. I dived into a book called This Savage Song by Victoria Schwab, author of The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which I loved. Well, actually, I liked a lot. And I remember, Laura, you were very lukewarm on. The Shades of Magic trilogy, which I loved. And I don't know, I think Laura couldn't bear to tell me that she didn't really like them.
Oh, I haven't tried those. I haven't actually tried them.
Oh, okay.
It's possible I might like them. I don't know. V. Schwab, though, she's...
I think one of the interesting things about her is that her books are quite different. If you liked one, like I loved The Shades of Magic, it's actually not then a given that you're going to like another. But then the great thing about that is that if those books didn't resonate with you, you could try something else by her, and that might. I think the thing is, she's a good enough writer. She can turn her hand convincingly in lots of different directions. So This Savage Song, we're in a strange, some kind of post-apocalyptic future where the city is divided, and in the north are one set of people who live in relative safety and prosperity, but only because they've made some kind of devil's bargain, and they pay this man called Callum Harker, who basically keeps them all safe, and they all have this medal. And the thing that they're all worried about being attacked by are these monsters. So there are these different kinds of monsters. They all sound vaguely biblical. There's the Malachi, there's the I can't remember now, the Kolderai something. And then there's our guy who's the Sunai. Anyway, at the beginning, you don't understand anything about these monsters. You don't know what's going on. And on this other side of the city is the monster side, is the side where people are living with the monsters. And there's this freedom force who's trying to keep people safe. And it's a much more hardscrabble, dangerous world in the south side. And there's this thing called the seam, which is separating the two sides of the city. And you learn about all this by these two protagonists. So you've got Kate Harker, who's the daughter of the evil Callum Harker, on the one side. And she's going to a school. She's been taken there in a limousine. She's attending the school. But you learn very quickly that she's had this incredibly troubled past. This is her 9th or 10th out of so many schools that she's been kicked out of. And everyone hates her because of who her father is. And then on the other side, we've got this character called August, who seems like a boy who's just going to the school and attending the school, but you know from the very beginning that something is not normal about him. There's some sort of strange things, you can't quite make sense of it. And I love that about this. What I loved was the way that it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense at the beginning. And you're really just like, what? I don't understand what's going on with these characters. Well, who is this character? Why is he going here? And I almost wanted to be a bit impatient with it. And I remember I had tried to read this book once before because I loved the Shades of Magic book so much. I tried to read this and I didn't get on with it. I was like, oh, I don't really like these characters. It's not the same. So I just put it to one side. This time I was more in the mood to give it more of a go. Also, I discovered this amazing thing. Do you know about BorrowBox, Phil?
No.
Oh, so good. So it's an app, like an e-reader app, but it's connected to your library. So if you have a membership of any library, which do you? I know I do. Do you not have a membership?
I do not. I'm like a bad book buyer. It's a very bad habit.
Well, so I love my local library. It's just like one of the many, many sources by which I consume books. But anyway, if you have a library membership, then you download this BorrowBox app and you key in the membership number that you have for your local library. And suddenly this world of audiobooks and ebooks is available for you at the touch of a finger. And so what was really great was that I probably wouldn't have paid money to download or buy a copy of this Savage Song, but I was really happy just to try it on BorrowBox and see. Anyway, so I did carry on with it. And then gradually the magic started to work. I just love that she's so good at characters and I love her dialogue. I love the way she does dialogue. I love the way that her characters say things that I really can imagine people actually saying. And they've got all kinds of issues. You know, this one's all worried about this and this one's all worried about this and they're all terribly smiled up. And I think that's the YA element to it. They're all on an emotional knife edge all the time. And then, you know, they have these real battles to fight and real monsters to kill. And it's all just done very well. And it's quite dark. It's quite violent. But it's this relationship between the two, almost the dark and the light, these two characters that carries you through. Much as the thing that I loved about the Darker Shades books was this relationship between these two main characters. And I thought, perhaps I just like books where there's like a really will they, won't they relationship. That will carry me through a lot.
You know, nothing wrong with that.
Anyway, I absolutely lapped this up. And while I read it, just to return by a very circuitous route to the original point that I was making, I had the knowledge that there was a follow-up called Our Dark Duet. So I just really savoured this, but also I was enjoying it so much and I was so happy to know that there was another book, which I'm now romping through. I would have to say, with my totally objective hat on, that I don't think it's quite as good as this Savage Song was. It's not working quite as well for me, but I'm still very forgiving of it and I'm having a great time reading it. I recommend them highly.
Kate, would you recommend this Savage Song or her trilogy?
The Dark Shades.
The magic
yeah,
one.
the magic one. I would recommend that. I love those books. I read them about 8 times.
But they're like 900 pages.
They're not that long. They're not that long. Yeah, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue was quite a long book, although maybe it was a book that just felt long.
Pointless
Yeah, I remember. I agree with you. I think you're right to say that it's a book where not that much happens for a long time. These books are not that. These books are very pacey. They're all action. But I think those Darker Shades books really nailed it for me. I thought the world building was so great and these characters and the things that they cared about and the way that they felt about each other. She's so good at all of that. I loved it.
Phil, to send us off, do you have any recent fantasy reads that
Do you read fantasy?
I
do read
Kate
fantasy.
Do you?
I'm reading just sort of before I go to sleep every day. It's some completely generic fantasy that I don't even know the name of. And it just sort of reminds me of the fantasy books I read when I was 13.
Yeah.
There's some boy, he has a lot of power, there's going to be dragons. I don't know, it's really dumb, but but I sort of love it for its generic blandness. And
I think that's what I needed as well.
that.
I think sometimes you just need to know that things aren't real. And
Exactly.
fantasy really gives you that, doesn't it?
Particularly like reading this before going to sleep. It's just like some dumb land that I'm in for a tiny bit. And then like as I fall into dreams, they might not be about my boring day job. So,
But for me to care about it, the characters have to be good. And we talked about there's good fantasy and there's just books that have dragons on the cover. And I think,
I think I'm reading the latter right now.
I saw that guy, Gabriel Kay, the Canadian fantasy writer, and I've read every single one of his books. He has a new one out, and I'm going to buy it for my long haul flight I'm on next week. And I am so excited. It's probably like 700 pages. I'm not going to have a child with me. It's going to be so good.
that is the dream. That's nearly it for this episode. Books discussed were The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, Matrix by Lauren Groff, The 16 Trees of the Somme by Lars Mytting, Islands of Abandonment by Cal Flynn, O Caledonia by Elspeth Barker, A High Wind in Jamaica by Richard Hughes, My Fourth Time We Drowned by Sally Hayden, The Naked Don't Fear the Water by Mathieu Akins, The Sympathiser by Viet Thanh Nguyen, This Savage Song and Our Dark Duet by V.E. Schwab, and we also mentioned The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue and the Shades of Magic trilogy by the same author. You might be listening to this episode just after we release it, or you might come across it at some later date. But if you have some thoughts and want to respond, you can always do so on our website. Head to thebookclubreview.co.uk and you'll find the page for this episode with details on all the books we discussed, a transcript and a comments forum. Messages there go straight to our inboxes, so do drop us a line anytime and let's keep the conversation going. We'd love to hear from you.
If you're not already, do subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And take a moment to rate and review the show, which helps us reach new listeners.
You can keep up with what we're reading between shows on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or send us an email at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. That's it for now. Thanks for listening and happy reading.